Welcome back. This is Discovering Confucius, a special interview series on Confucius, a titan of Chinese civilization and a great contributor to the world's wisdom. More than 2 millennia ago, Confucius put forward the thought of harmony without uniformity when China was in its warring states period of time, one of the most chaotic in Chinese history. More than 2,000 years later, what can we learn from the wisdom of the sage? The answer is not definite, but evolving. One way to draw inspiration is to visit the place where Confucius came from, which is where I am now, in Qufu, the birthplace of Confucius. Or visit places in which the wisdom is recorded and handed down through generations. That's what Jeremiach Jenne and I did when we decided to stroll down the Confucius Temple in downtown Beijing. As a writer and historian, Jeremiah has been fascinated by China's culture and history. He also knows the area quite well.
So this is one of the artifacts that's on the main street here. And this is one of 2 stone tablets, one on each side of the entrance to the Confucian Temple, that reminded people back in the day that official, regular person, whoever you were, this was the place where you must get off your horse and continue the rest of the way by foot out of respect for the Confucian Temple, which is just down the street.
The place we visited over the years has become a popular tourist place for urban youth in Beijing. It's fascinating to see how people are living in history and being part of it. I discussed that with Jeremiah in a quiet corner of a small alley right across the way from the Confucius Temple. Jeremiah, this is a place that you're so familiar with. You show your international students around a lot.
Yeah, it's a beautiful part of Beijing. It's a part of Beijing I visit a lot. It's a part of Beijing I really like to share with people who are coming from overseas.
What were some of the questions your students would ask you about Confucius or Confucianism?
Well, since my students are coming mostly from North America, they're usually familiar with the name Confucius, but they don't have a lot of understanding of who he was or how his ideas eventually evolved into a worldview that's shared by many people in China, particularly people who are Han Chinese. And so one of the things I try to do is to help them understand a little bit more about where Confucius came from, what were some of his basic ideas. Of course, you can spend an entire lifetime discussing all the different permutations and evolutions of Confucian thought, but I try to give them some basic understanding of what Confucius had to say and some of his followers as well, and then try to connect that a little bit with the history and then also a little bit with what's going on in China today.
When Confucius' own philosophical thought were born, it was a very different period of time. The warring states where a lot of chaotic and conflicts are taking place all at the same time.
Right, we're looking at the end of the Zhou civilization, a time when China's divided up into many different kingdoms. And as a result, all these different states are competing, they're fighting, and they're also kind of looking for the best answer to how to become the strongest state. That's part of it, but the other part too is with all of these places fighting and all of the competition, it's a really hard time to be alive in that era. And Confucius, the person we know as Confucius, along with many other people, were asking a question like, what happened? What went wrong? How can we fix this?
And he had his solutions.
Yeah, I mean, Confucius, again, this is a generalization because, of course, people spend their entire lives studying Confucius, but he looked at society and he felt that things had started to fall apart when people forgot that they're not just individuals, they're also people who exist in relationships. We're not just ourselves, we're also people's sons, fathers, rulers, daughters, mothers, friends, husbands, wives. And in these relationships is how we exist as a society, as people.
So to me, it's quite amazing that at a time when everyone was trying to seek survival in a very chaotic society, he was trying to create this kind of network that people can feel rely on when a time of, vulnerability.
Sure, and I think he also tried to remind people that within these relationships, it's not just about how we relate to each other, it's also that within these relationships we have this feeling of empathy, humanity, benevolence, what his disciples wrote down as ren, and this idea that I should be able to see in you that part of me. it's also guided by a spirit of ritual. And of course, that doesn't just mean like birthday parties and weddings, but all the little interactions that we have every day that help remind us of how we relate to each other.
That was his time, right?
That's right.
The Warring States period of time. But you see Confucius' philosophical thoughts later being developed into so-called the Confucianism has been very much a leading political thought, quote unquote, for many dynasties followed, especially feudal dynasties.
It was, and I think one thing I try to impress with my students is that it wasn't overnight. There was a long evolution. You know, even after Confucius's death, there was disciples and followers, and they helped to develop some of his ideas. But it really wasn't until you get to the Han era, you know, several centuries after Confucius's death, that his ideas are beginning to be incorporated into a kind of imperial ideology. And even then, it would take maybe, you know, another several centuries before Confucianism, as we kind of think of it in the imperial era, really kind of takes full form as the dominant ideology at court. I mean, it had to contend not only with a lot of political upheaval, there was a lot of times when the dynasties would break apart and certain kingdoms would privilege other schools of thought over Confucianism. But by the time we get to the end of the Tang era, we get to like the 8th and 9th century AD, and particularly in the Song, that's where we start to see kind of Confucianism beginning to be truly internalized by the elite, and from that, through the education system, through the examination system, eventually becoming kind of the dominant political ideology of the empire, kind of the way a lot of people imagine it for that era.
That was Confucius and Confucius thoughts over the past dynasties. But when you look at the past 200 years, when China was trying to reprioritize what needs to be done, it's a different story, isn't it?
Once we get into the turn of the 20th century, the idea of Confucianism as a synonym for civilization, you know, from Kang Yue, from the late 19th century and before, if I was to go up to a friend of mine who was studying at the Imperial Academy here and said, I would like to be a Confucian, they would say, of course you do, sir, you would want to be civilized. And they would take me in and teach me. But if I were to say that today at the Imperial Academy, they would say, why aren't you wearing your face mask? And then they would say, well, are you sure? Because you're not Chinese. How can you be Confucian? And one of the things I think happens in the early 20th century is this changeover from where Confucianism defines all of civilization to where Confucianism starts to define a particular civilization. And of course, that change also means that how people within that culture also understand Confucianism, not necessarily as an overarching explanation for the whole world, but something that makes us who we are, something to be preserved so that our culture and our tradition can be preserved.
From being the whole garden into actually a beautiful flower in the garden again.
Right, and the idea too is with that flower, with that treasure, if you will, when we preserve something, often that can involve nurturing it, but it also sometimes involves protecting it in a way that sometimes makes it hard for it to grow and spread. And so when we start to conserve things, when we start to preserve a tradition, sometimes that affects how that tradition can then develop further. An analogy I use with my students is the music form jazz. Jazz in the early 20th century was a living art form that was constantly expanding and developing. But by the end of the 20th century, it was an art form that people were play the right way. We got to preserve this tradition. And when we start to preserve the tradition, sometimes it's harder to then make innovations and to develop it. So I think one of the many kind of turns Confucianism takes in the 20th century is this notion, okay, now it's our tradition, it is our thing to preserve. What does that mean as a living tradition going forward?
That is a great debate it created during that period of time. And one could say even today.
Absolutely. I think when we get to the turn of the 20th century, and particularly in the sort of difficult years after the 1911 revolution, in the early years of the Republic of China, a lot of people are looking at Chinese society in general, and they'd moved beyond this idea of stretching Confucianism to cover reform into an idea that maybe Confucianism was the problem. It was holding China back. Except when we look at the writings of people that appeared, people like Shan Duxiu, for example, it almost seems to me, and again, this is my interpretation, but of course, part of it is Confucianism, but part of it is Confucianism as a synonym for everything we don't like about our parents. This idea, like all of tradition, all of this stuff that's holding us back, the way it restrains women, the way it means that we can't marry who we want, we can't live the way we live. Confucianism as an idea gets blamed for it all. And so a lot of the very iconoclastic attacks on Confucianism, particularly during that new culture, May 4th, early Republic era, you know, they obviously are reacting to this notion that progress needs to happen. But there's also an element of it too, that almost the entire fabric of Confucianism, Confucius would be like, wait a second, I didn't say you needed to do that, I didn't say you needed to do that, but because kind of their whole idea was that the traditional side was holding it back, tradition meant Confucius, Confucius meant Confucianism, let's get rid of it all. I think one of the things is this notion of relationships being very important. And I think the idea, and again, I want to be careful because I don't want to slip into kind of essentialism, you know, because obviously everybody's different. But I do believe that one of the things I've noticed when living in Beijing is that, of course, the balance between who we are as individuals and who we are in relationship to other people is a little bit more even than it might be in some other cultures. That is to say, coming out of the United States, where, of course, I grew up and was taught with good self-esteem, I am a beautiful individual creature worthy of love and respect, and I am. But in China, I also learned that I'm also somebody's friend, teacher, student, and I need to be able to act within that network of relationships in a way that emphasizes that empathy, reciprocity, and ritual. Now, do people go around saying, well, that's because it's Confucius? Of course not. Right. But it's there anyway.
And Confucius as a person, as a historical figure, and also Confucianism as, some could argue, a part of the philosophy, has been studied around the world. And we see that study and observation, interpretation of them could vary from time to time according to who was studying them and what time they were being studied. That is also very interesting, beyond borders.
Sure. I think as an interesting example, one of the earliest groups in Beijing to study Confucianism were the Jesuits who arrived in the 16th century. And two of the things they gifted to the world through their appreciation of Confucianism was, one, they really wanted to emphasize the humanist side of Confucianism. They wanted to desacralize the teachings because, of course, they wanted to be sure that people could be Catholic and Confucian at the same time. So they were part of they began kind of this idea that Confucianism exists somewhere between philosophy and religion, even though those terms, as we understand them today, didn't really exist at the time. The other thing the Jesuits do, of course, is they help to give Confucius his name. We always think, in China, of course, everyone calls him Kongzi, and eventually he gets his hip-hop name, Grandmaster Kong, Kung-Fu Zi. And, you know, the Jesuits, in their wonderful way, said, he's a great moral philosopher, but if you're going to be a great moral philosopher, you got to have a Latin name. He was born in Shandong. Doesn't matter. He has to have a Latin name. So they Latinized Kung-Fu to Confucius. So your example of how people around the world have studied Confucius, not only has that helped bring Chinese culture to the rest of the world, but it's an interesting how, in the study of Confucius internationally, it's also in some ways helped to influence how Confucius is understood, not only in the world, but even a little bit in China.
And that also, in return, having an impact about Chinese understanding of Confucius as a person and also about Confucianism as part of the philosophy. You know, how others are looking at it. We are looking at the mirror, and the mirror could also help us how to adjust the way we dress. And that eventually could also have an impact on the way we look anyway. So this back and forth, the ping pong effect in a way, it's very interesting.
It's been really interesting too how beginning in the 20th century you still had in a lot of academic institutions and universities outside of China people studying Confucianism and even making some really important contributions to the development of Confucian thought. You know, we sometimes talk about the Harvard School of Neo-Confucians, and I think there are people who are better than I am to talk about that, but I do find that process very fascinating.
It seems that Confucius and Confucianism is like a box of chocolate, that everybody could find something that they want at the time when they want it and take advantage of it so that they could find something that what they need.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting metaphor there, and I think that's true of many different schools of thought around the world. I think also, you know, we're right across the street from the Imperial Academy, CGTN, And I think one of the interesting things about that space is if Confucianism is like a box of chocolate, people can kind of take whatever they want from it. The purpose of Guozi Jian wasn't just education. It was also to make sure that the chocolate was well labeled and people knew exactly which pieces they should take and which pieces they should leave in the box. And of course, they did that not only through an educational curriculum there, but also supervising the examination system as well, which was part of that.
You've been living and working in China for decades.
About 20 years now.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
And I think over the 20 years, you have had a lot of friends. And you become, in a way, part of China. Because over the past 20 years, you interacted with the Chinese society. They impacted you, and you impacted them. So, you know, as someone in this niche, how do you see Confucius, a very abstract concept, and Confucianism, my philosophy, is having an impact on someone like you?
I feel like, especially when I first arrived in China, which is in the 2000s, that I felt that Confucianism as an idea, it was really exciting to me, the way people were developing it and the way it was organically evolving within, say, pop culture spaces and also academic spaces. And it was providing a really interesting meeting point for historians, philosophers, political science professors, academics to meet and discuss different ideas and compare Confucianism with other schools of thought around the world. You know, that hasn't happened as much in the last 10 years, but I feel like it could still eventually be a space.
And that is so relevant today.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Jeremiah.
Thank you.
I love everything you explained.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you for having me.